stage, I'd like to welcome you and also to welcome our speaker, Matu, who will introduce himself. Thank you, Bal.
Thanks, Margaret. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the presentation. Glad you could all make it. I'm going to introduce the topic that we're talking about, cybersecurity and the importance of security posture. In a short while, I'll just start by introducing myself. I'm a Cyber Essentials Plus certification auditor and also a certification body for providing that certification. We also do TickITplus training and lead auditor training. A little bit about myself. Got my industrial experience in mainly in the defence industry. I was a consultant auditor and trainer for a certification body. I've been doing audits, consultancy and training for 30 odd years on a contract basis for many of the large accredited certification bodies. I've been a lead auditor since 1992, and I currently audit on TickITplus 20,000, 27,000, 22301 and TISAX, also the World Lottery Association, and I'm a CREST registered pen tester and a certified ethical hacker. So today's talk is really going to be about my experience of how I think that when you're implementing a lot of these standards in terms of an information security management system, where you're going for just a security management system because you want to have a good sort of basis for controlling the information you have in your organization. The way that you can do it, or the way that you implement the system, makes a big difference to how effective it can be. And I've classed that term, the posture, getting the right posture for the organization. Now, the way I've prepared the presentation, it's an enhanced version from one that I delivered a couple of years ago, and it's split into the same 4 sections. Part 1, I'm going to introduce the topic a little bit more and talk about why having a good security posture is important. Then I'm going to talk about 4 schemes or frameworks that are available to help people implement information security management systems, and I'm going to highlight some of the differences between the different frameworks, but I'm also going to highlight the similarities, you know, what's common in these frameworks. Then in part 3, which is the real heart of the presentation, we're going to use a scenario to go through a little implementation sort of exercise of where we're going to look at the risks and look at how controls can be implemented in a way that creates that security posture that is going to make all the difference to how effective the ISMS works within the business. And finally, we're going to go back and look back at where we set off in the introduction on a summary slide that's going to sort of reinforce some of the ideas that I've been able to sort of like include throughout the 4 part sections. So starting off with part 1 then, the introduction. So security posture, it's not just about the technical aspects of your information security, but it also covers the physical, cultural and behavioural aspects. But the way they're put together is really, and the way it's implemented is really all about effective leadership and governance. And it's that leadership and governance that contributes the most to get in a good security posture. Without that leadership and governance, organisations struggle to get the right posture. So security compliance is all about complying with a security framework and getting a certificate, hanging a certificate on the wall. But posture's more about an organisation's ability to protect itself from these threats and how well it can respond effectively and in a timely manner when that event occurs. And these days, it's not a case of if that sort of security event occurs, it's when, really. So all organisations need to be ready, and if you've got a good security posture, it's going to make you, it's going to put you in a position to be able to respond and react effectively when you need to. So just to set the scene a little bit, the World Economic Forum, does a survey on a regular basis, and recently, this is quite recent, there was a survey involving nearly 1,500 global experts, and in their responses, 39% of them felt that cyber attacks were presenting a material crisis on a global scale in 2024. So, it's in amongst there with all the other risks, such as extreme weather and the cost of living and things like that. So cyber attacks is fifth in their rankings. ENISA is the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, and I've got the link in the slide there. You can download a very good report. They do an annual report, and what it does is it highlights the trends in terms of how the threat landscape is changing. Now, I've picked out, what was it, six of the 5 of the areas that are highlighted in this, but there's a lot more in the report. And the idea is that these are the prevalent threats at the moment. Ransomware is ranked to be the top, and phishing is up there again as one of the most common ones for being able to engineer their initial access. Last year, a couple of years ago, when I did this presentation, the professionalizing or phishing as a service was a recent thing, and now it continues, and it's growing at quite a rate. There's 2 new terminologies that have come into the frame. One is business email compromise, and the other is vendor email compromise, and these have become a favourite means of obtaining financial gain by these bad actors. And supply chain attacks are sort of are often a way that an organisation gets entry into an organisation's IT systems, and they target the administrators, people with elevated privileges. So those are typically administrators or developers of the systems. So these threats are ongoing and real, and what a security posture can do for you is prepare you. And the key thing is, if you've got a good security posture, you're actually sort of confirming that you can predict, prevent, and respond to threats. And this response is the key, because it's no good thinking that it's not going to happen to your organisation, because it will happen. It just happens to varying degrees. And if you've got a good posture, if you've prepared well, then you'll be okay and the organisation will survive. But if, on the other hand, you haven't managed to prepare and the posture is very weak, it could be very damaging, both reputationally and financially. So what are the frameworks? So I've picked 4 common frameworks, and they're the same frameworks that I used last time, and it's an indication of how the landscape is changing. That all of these frameworks have changed in the last 2 years. The Cyber Essentials scheme has been updated. ISO 27001 has been reissued. I think there's somebody who's not on mute. The NIST framework has been updated to version 2, and the TickITplus scheme has reissued its base process library. So all of them have changed, and they've all changed in the light of how they contribute to information security. So I'll highlight some of the areas that they've changed as we go through. So let's start with the Cyber Essentials scheme. Now, the Cyber Essentials scheme is a UK government-backed scheme, and if you want to tender for UK government contracts, it's one of those schemes that you have to be registered for to be able to do the tender. The scheme owner is the National Cyber Security Centre here in the UK, and what happens is that there's 5 areas where the controls are mandated. There's some mandated controls around firewalls, secure configuration of devices and equipment, user access controls, malware protection, and security updates, patching mainly. So there's mandated requirements around these 5 areas that they have to be demonstrated as being controlled and meeting the requirements in order to get that certification. Now, there's 2 levels to that certification, which I'll explain in a short while. But now, ISO 27001 recently updated to the 22 version, ISO 2022 version. And what I wanted to point out here was that there's a section in here about risks, and there's a section in here about risks. Now, what happens is ISO 27000 is organised around a plan, do, check, act cycle, in that you plan the management system, then you operate the management system, you check how well that management system is working under performance evaluation, and then you act on what that evaluation tells you to improve the way it's working. And then you go around it again. It's a cycle, plan, do, check, act. All of the ISO standards follow that same cycle of plan, do, check, act. Now, in terms of the ISO 27001 information security, what makes it different from the other ISO standards is that it wants you to base the planning on risks, in that it wants you to have a risk assessment and treatment plan at the planning stage, but also then during the operational stage. You have to identify the ongoing information risks during your delivery processes, and each of them, those risks needs to be treated in terms of its information security risks that you've identified. And to help you to do that, the annex to ISO 27000 has a list of controls, which I'll explain more about shortly. So if we compare the Cyber Essentials scheme to ISO 27001, what we'll notice is that there's some things that are things that are similar, but there are also some things that are different. So let's start off with the risk assessment. Now, with Cyber Essentials scheme, it's a very much narrower scope than 27000 because it's mainly focused on internet-borne risks from, as the name implies, cyber risks related to the access to the internet and connections to the internet. Whereas the ISO 27001 is a management system around the organisation for that business. And that also covers off risks to do with people or HR and site, physical access to the site, or so it's not just internet. There are other technical risks that are in the scope for ISO 27001. But the key difference is, with Cyber Essentials, the risk assessment has been done by the scheme owner, the National Cybersecurity Centre, and they dictate or mandate what the controls are to manage those risks, and they are looking out for protecting those organisations that are handling citizen data in the way that they are delivering services to central government or local government. But with ISO 27001, there's a requirement to perform a risk assessment, and each organisation performs its own risk assessment. And they set their own risk appetite, their own risk thresholds, and then they look to the annex of the standard to control and treat the risks down to an acceptable level of what they think is or they feel is acceptable. So the difference essentially is who is setting the threshold and who's identifying the risks and who's performing the risks. Now, in Cyber Essentials, because it's a much narrower scope, there are 5 key control themes, which are firewall, secure configuration, user access, malware protection, and security update management. Whereas with ISO 27000, there are 4 categories: organisation, people, physical, technological, but there are 93 controls. So a lot more controls around 4 categories, but covering the whole organisation. Whereas Cyber Essentials is really focused on the internet-borne risks and cyber risk specifically. Now, the recent update to 27000 brought in a lot more emphasis on cloud security and on privacy and personally identifiable information type controls. And the Cyber Essentials scheme has recently mandated that any cloud services must be protected with multi-factor authentication wherever it's available. So that's 2 examples of where those schemes have been updated recently to address the ongoing cyber risks. There are 2 levels of Cyber Essentials certification. One is a self-declared assessment, where you do the checks yourselves and you declare where you're at, but then those answers are verified, and we call it the verified self-assessment. So the answers are verified by a competent and trained assessor to check that the answers meet the scheme requirements. But there's also a second level, which we call Cyber Essentials Plus, and that is where the assessor actually performs some security tests, such as sending emails with payloads and seeing how the email applications and the browsers are managing and handling those payloads that are sort of simulated payloads of virus types and ransom type signatures. The idea is that the assessor tests the answers that were given in the self-assessment. So there are 2 parts to it. And some government contracts only require to have the self-assessment certification, and some government contracts require to have both the CE self-assessment and the Plus assessment. Now, when it comes to ISO 27001, it's normal to get a certification audit performed by an accredited certification body, and the certification auditors will ask questions and look for evidence that the policies that meet the requirements in the standard have been effectively implemented, but they don't do any testing. They don't send any emails or do any vulnerability scans to check the configuration of the devices, but they want to see that the organization being assessed has done something like that, because ISO 27000, one of the controls is to do technical vulnerability assessments, and another control will be around patching and secure configuration. So it's up to the organization to do it to the level of the risks that they perceive, and then the auditors will assess to see if it's implemented in the way that the organization's own risk assessment required it to be implemented. Now, the Cyber Essentials scheme is focusing on vulnerabilities and weaknesses from the internet, whereas the ISO 27000 is a much broader scope, and it's basically any information that the organization has declared in its scope. And the risk assessment is what's going to determine the level of control, and so you're almost setting your own thresholds and risk appetite. Now, the Cyber Essentials scheme will do a scan of all of the we'll do a scan of all of the TCP UDP ports and for across the external IP addresses to check that the external interface to the internet is configured correctly and that there aren't any unexpected ports open, and that any ports that are open have a business case and justification for being open. All the end user devices will be scanned for vulnerabilities in that they have been patched to the for any security patches that have been released in the last 14 days. The malware protection must be configured and installed and working as per the supplier or the manufacturer's recommendations. The browsers must be updated and patched. And they can't be configured outside of the recommended best practices. All cloud services, if they make it available, if they have two-factor or multi-factor access available, then it must be being used to pass Cyber Essentials. You can't have a situation where you're using a cloud service that offers MFA, but you haven't enabled it. The user and administrator accounts must be separate accounts. So you can't have a situation where a user also has administrator capabilities or access. So these are all of the requirements in the Cyber Essentials scheme. It's very focused on protecting access through the internet, emails, and browsers. The ISO 27000 is basically wants you to identify your risks against your information assets, but much broader than just cloud services or internet connections. It includes access to the buildings, access to the site, access to information, even paper information, and the idea is that you go through the risk assessment of all of your information assets and then identify which risks need to be treated using the 93 controls that are listed in the annex. And the idea is that any controls that you use, you have to justify why you're using them because you've identified they're needed because of the risk assessment. But more importantly, any that you then feel that you don't need to use, you have to justify why they're not needed for your scope of certification. So really, most organizations will end up using most, if not all, of the 93 controls listed in Annex A. And then the certification body will check the evidence when the organisation during that audit demonstrates how effective their management system is in implementing those controls to manage the risks that they identified in their risk assessment. And this has to be supported with objective evidence that the auditor can see as proof that those processes are effective. The American National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, have a cyber security framework, and this is equivalent to the UK Cyber Essentials scheme, where if you want to sort of have recognition from US government organisations or customers, they want you to have implemented this framework. Now, the recent change to this, it was only updated last month in February 26th, towards the end of last month, and they added this govern function. This didn't exist in the earlier version, and it's quite appropriate, really, because one of the things that we're going to talk about is that exactly that, you know, in terms of to make this thing work, the govern part of any information security management system is very sort of important into how well the system, how effective the system is in protecting the business. Because ultimately, it's the leadership that's responsible for and accountable for the cybersecurity risks within the business. So that, you know, without that govern, you struggle really to make it all gel together and work effectively. But the other areas, what some of the controls from the other areas, identify, protect, detect, and respond, have been moved into govern, and there's been some new controls added as well. But so one of the emphasis is on supplier risks, much more than it was in the previous version. So it's organised around these 6 functions. There's one of the good things about the CSF framework is that most managers can relate to it, because this catalogue, the CSF core, which I'll show you in a minute, the catalogue controls, like starting off with those words, identify, protect, detect, and respond. Most management can relate to those words, and they can relate to the fact that in terms of information security, we want to identify what it is. We want to identify what we want to protect. We want to protect it. If something tries to attack it, we want to be able to detect that that's happened, and we need to be able to respond to it, almost like the life cycle of an incident. So it's very easy for management to understand where those functions have come from. Then what happens is you identify outcomes from a catalogue, and then you have organizational profiles that enable you as a business to say where you are currently, where you'd like to be, what the gap is, what the difference between those two states is, and then produce a plan to plug it. And they give you templates. I'll share them with you in a minute. They give you some templates to help you do this. So it's a very much a practical framework that helps organizations to start their journey on this journey of getting their security posture right. What it doesn't do, though, is offer any sort of certification, an external sort of verification for it. Although there are organisations that do it, it's not the same as the Cyber Essentials scheme or an ISO 27000 certification. But there's no reason why you can't use the CSF framework as part of your journey to get ISO 27000 or Cyber Essentials certification. Now, this is what the Cyber Essentials framework looks like. So this is the new function that govern that has been introduced in the recent update. And so what happens is you get the function, it breaks it into a category, and then that category breaks into subcategories. There's a whole host of them. And then there's some examples of how you could demonstrate that you've achieved that subcategory. So, and as you start from the left and you go to the right, the speak becomes more technical. So the biggest value from this scheme over the others is this simplicity and the terminology that it uses. But it also provides you with these templates. And this is an oversimplified one. There's much longer spreadsheets that you can download from the CSF from the NIST website. And the idea is that you identify the things from the catalogue, the identifiers and the descriptions, and then you examine where you currently are, what you've got in place already, what's the status of them, and you rate them in terms of you know, how complete are they, or where are you with them, and then you sort of say, well, where do we want to be? How important is this to our business? And where do we want to be? How formal do we want to take this? And so then the plan is, using the scheme, is that you move from your current profile to your target profile. And because you've got all of these different sort of areas covered by the framework, you can select the priority for some areas to be higher than other areas because you feel that they're more important as a business, or because you feel that those assets are more at risk, or because you think that an exposure in that area would be more damaging or more hurt the business more than in another. So you can tune it to your needs. The fourth scheme that I wanted to introduce was TickITplus. And TickITplus is a UK scheme, and it brings together from an ISO perspective 3 ISO standards, and most IT companies these days have 1, 2, or even 3, all 3 of these certifications. And so this scheme is good for bringing them together. And this document that I'm going to share now is called the base process library, and it's freely downloadable from the TickITplus website. The base process library is based on 40 processes. That's 40 processes that are based on 2 ISO standards. One's on software development lifecycle, and the other one is on systems and software engineering systems lifecycle. So one's called ISO 12207, and the other one's ISO 15288. Now, using the terminology from those ISO standards, the TickITplus committee has come up with this library of processes that covers all aspects of most IT delivery organizations. And what they did was created a library of profiles, 8 profiles. And if I just expand again so you can see them. So if you're starting your journey on implementing these standards, you select one or more of these scope profiles. You have to have at least one in order to meet the scheme requirements. But most IT organizations would be able to relate to two, as I say, or three. And just taking the ones from on the left here, information security, service management, and systems and software development and support. And what happens is a type A process is mandatory. So every organization, as you can see, regardless of which profile you do, it's applicable. The tick means that that process, HR management process, is applicable to everyone. The management framework process is applicable to everyone, and so forth. Now, when it comes to something like security management, it's applicable if you're going for information security. It's applicable if you're going for service management, but it's not applicable if you go for systems and software development. But what would be applicable if you go for systems and software development would be things like configuration management. Configuration and change management is applicable to all three of those scope profiles that I talked to. So if we went for something like information management, if we go for something like information management here, it's applicable for information security and it's applicable for service management, but not for systems and software development. I've highlighted the problem and incident management one because I'm going to use it later I'm going to use it on the next slide to explain a little bit more about how the scheme works. So this idea of the 40 base process libraries around these 8 scope profiles is that you don't have to worry about what processes you need, because the scheme is saying you need to have a risk management process, and then you could go to that process in this base process library and it will tell you the sort of things and map it to the relevant standards, like I'll show you now. So I'll use the problem and incident management process as an example. And every process is laid out like this. It has some outcomes and it has a purpose. And the idea is that you perform these base practices in a way that you achieve this outcome, which will lead to you achieving the process purpose. So you have some sort of focus for what to do, in which order, why, and what you want to get out of it. Now, all of the processes are split like this, and usually the very last process in each of these base practices is based on the journey of improvement. And it's this, and that is the key thing to most management system frameworks or standards, is that they are the basis for bringing about improvements. So if we take a security incident as an example, you know, the base practice 1 says you'll have procedures for how you do it. Number 2 will say that you have got to record it and you've got to inform people and you have records of how you handled it. And number 3 will say, look, you need to analyze them and learn from them. And then number 4 is sort of saying, if you need help, get help and escalate it. Now, for each requirement in the base practices, it points to the actual clauses that relate to that base practice. So here's 27,001-22. So it helps you do the mapping of these clauses into a practical step-by-step activity around a process. So rather than just having a clause in a standard that talks about information security incidents, now we have a framework and a map of how we can achieve good security incident management processes and cross-check them against what the standard is saying about those areas. For instance, section 10 in most of these frameworks is improvement, and these other clauses will also be related to learning and security incidents and fixing things when they go not as expected, as it were. So we've covered very briefly 4 frameworks. So what's common about them? Well, the good thing is that if they're done well, they will all provide a good security posture. And in the next section, I'll tell you how that can be impacted by the way that you implement the system. They all require you to know what it is that you're trying to protect. That is the business critical assets. And they all are based on a risk assessment and need a gap assessment approach to manage or treat those risks. They all talk about leadership, and they need leadership to make the controls happen. They all require an element of scorecards, dashboard, governance, in other words. They all require you to learn from incidents, and they all expect training programs to be implemented for information security. So I'm going to pull all that together now and go through a practical sort of scenario which pulls out some of the examples of how we can create this, implement the systems, but also create that secure security posture that everybody needs to make this happen well. So consider the context of an organization that is a software development company. They're using Jira and GitLab, and they're developing software. They've got staff working in more than one place. So they might have some staff working from home. They might have a couple of offices. But basically, people are connecting to the systems remotely. And they outsource some activities, so they've got some suppliers as well. So the first thing we need to do is identify what is our business critical information assets that we need to protect. So, as well as identifying those assets, we need to identify who is the owner of them. And identifying the owner of them is key to starting our journey of making sure that we get a good security posture. And the higher up the organization tree that we can identify the asset owners, the better. And obviously we've got to balance that, because some board members and some organizations are so big that the higher up you go, the less sort of day-to-day involvement they'll have. But what we want to do is try and get it as high in the organization as we can, that it's still practical. So for instance, in this instance, a good owner for the Jira systems would be the development director. And a good owner for the developers' laptops would be the development director. So, and also for the source code that we've got in GitLab, we could make the development director. It could be the software manager, it could be the software team leader. But what we want to do is go as high as we possibly can in the organization. Now, once we know who the owner is, then we ask them to identify the criticality value of that data that we're trying to protect. And you can use something as simple as a very crude high, medium, low. It's the owner's responsibility then to say who should have access to that data. And it's the owner's responsibility to say how often the data should be backed up. Now, very often what happens is that the IT department might make all those decisions, and they might make those decisions very well, and they might get it right. The difficulty with that approach is that it's the director, the development, in this instance, it would be the development director that is controlling the resources that would maybe do the access reviews. It'd be the resources that are required to maybe do the backup, restore, testing. And if the development director hasn't been involved in the risk assessment and decisions, when it comes to requesting the required resources, that's when you will struggle. So the exercise itself is a sort of precursor to getting the security posture right. It's a one-off exercise, and it's almost like planting the seeds so that we can grow a good system later. So if we were to do the risk assessment in a very sort of simplistic way, we might identify these 6 risks to our scenario, and looking at the various standards, the frameworks, we could pick up these controls associated to help us manage these risks. Using the example of, okay, we might get data corruption, or there might be a hardware failure. Okay, well, we can refer to our backups and restore things and rebuild things, and we'll be fine. The key thing is that if those backups are taken too infrequently, we're gonna potentially lose a week's work. If they're taken weekly, if they're taken monthly, we're going to take a month's. We're going to potentially lose a month's work. If they're taken daily, we're going to lose a day's work. And for different businesses, that will be acceptable as a cost, and other businesses it won't be acceptable. And sometimes, even in the life of a project, there'll be some periods of a project where there is so much work going on, you might want to take the backups hourly, or daily, as opposed to weekly, the way you would normally. Now, a rating matrix has been around for a long, long time, and it's a very good way of working out who is accountable, who's responsible, who should be informed, and who should be consulted when working out the level of control. Because what happens is, when you introduce security controls, invariably you introduce a degree of inconvenience to the users. And if the senior managers are not bought into why that control needs to be at the level it's decided to be at, then it gets very hard for a quality manager or an information or an IT manager to enforce it, because generally most of the organisation that have to follow those policies don't work directly for the IT manager or the quality manager. They work for the operational teams or the functional team managers. And unless those directors or managers, senior managers, have been involved in working out the level of control and what control needs to be applied to protect the information assets, then you're going to struggle to get the right level of management support and governance to make the control work well. So what's needed is for the managers to be able to manage and steer the ship is some dashboards or scorecards, a way of having your finger on the pulse and knowing where you're up to with these controls, and which ones you need to push harder on and which ones not. So usually it's a form of dashboards and scorecards that do that. So the risks will each of those risks that we mentioned earlier will be able to pick out controls out of each of the frameworks, or a mixture of frameworks, and they're pretty common. For instance, the backups should exist in at least 3 places for them to be effective, and it's the asset owner that needs to be involved on how often they're taken. The business impact assessments that are done as part of the business continuity plan, again, they should be discussed and agreed with the asset owners of the assets that are being impacted. When it comes to theft and loss of physical is probably the easiest one to relate to. We should be learning from our security incidents. And again, it's the managers who should be asking for the what have we learned as a proof of the organisation is learning from it, because that's the big value. Then when we come to technical controls, we've got to, there is so much information out there to be monitored from various tools. It's got to be done through dashboards and scorecards. And then when we get to the final one, which is the most important one, which is every user in every organization needs to be trained on information security. And if you look at the NCSC website, you can actually download some very good information security awareness training that you can then incorporate if you haven't already got some. And it covers things like phishing and use of strong passwords and how to secure your devices. And there's even a little quiz at the end of it as a sort of a test of understanding. So if I'm going to summarize all of this, to get a good posture, then what we've first of all got to do is identify these owners of the assets, not just let the IT team do it. The owners need to be people out there in the business, and usually the higher up we can get them, the better. And then we can use a mixture of frameworks. We don't have to be constrained by using only one framework. Essentially, most of the frameworks say the same thing, but they just do it in different ways. Once we implement the controls, when we do the gaps, again, we've got to involve the asset owners and risk owners. They don't have to do it day to day, but they need to be involved so that when we have to push hard to get these controls to work, they understand what it is we're trying to do. It's the scorecards and the dashboards that give that information to the managers to help us get the right posture and get the right culture in the organisation. We need to be learning from incidents and improving all the way through, very much like that plan, do, check, act. And training needs to be tailored for different people within the organisation. Different levels in the organisation, different departments will need to have slightly different information security awareness training. Okay, so I've gone on a little bit longer than I expected to, but that's the presentation. Thanks for listening, and I think we're going to move on to questions now.